What's up everyone, this is Dariusz Kalbarczyk, co-founder of MG Poland, JS Poland, Quick Poland and WorkshopFest.dev. Welcome back to the JavaScript Master Podcast. Today we've got a special guest from Austin, USA. RxJS core team lead, speaker, author, art lover, ladies and gentlemen, Ben Lesh. Hi Ben, how are you?
Great, how are you?
Thank you, I'm great. For those who don't know you yet, please tell us about yourself and what do you do?
Sure. Well, my name is Ben Lesh. I'm currently living in Austin, Texas, and I have been working on, I'm most well known for working on a project called RxJS that I've been working on for about 7 years. So that involves reactive programming, observables, those sorts of things. So that's what I'm most known for. In the past, I've worked at companies like Netflix and Google. More recently, I've been working for financial tech companies like Bridgewater and Citadel. And now I'm a free agent. I was laid off a little while ago, but I should be starting a new job here soon. But yeah, so mostly what people know me for is RxJS though.
How did you become interested in programming and what led you to focus on front-end development?
The way I became interested in programming was I'm a person that likes to create things and tinker with things. And I think the first program I ever wrote was on a Commodore 64, with whatever, Pet Basic, I think was the name of the language. So you do 10, print Ben is cool, and then 20, go to 10, and so it would say my name on the television, oh, Ben is cool. And I was like, wow, look at this. The most amazing thing to me was my name and something that I made happen was happening on the TV because it was plugged into an actual television. It was happening on the TV at the time, and I thought that was really neat. And then after that, I played with other I was making games with a thing called Gary Kitchen's Game Maker on C64, and then I tinkered with things mostly. And then after a while, I had gone to art school. I had left art school, and I was working at a company doing graphic design, and they had they had some work done on their website, and they weren't delivering it very quickly. And I asked, I was like, the contractors weren't delivering quickly. And I said, well, can I have a look at it? And I looked at it and I'm like, wow, I can actually read this code. I think I could do this. And so I fiddled with it a little bit, and then I fiddled with some stuff at home. And one of the guys I worked with was like, Ben, you could make way more money doing this for a living than doing graphic design. And I'm like, okay. So that was kind of how I got my start and my interest in doing it professionally anyway.
Can you talk about your experience working at Netflix and Google and what you learned during that time?
First thing I can tell you is as soon as I got to Netflix, I've really felt like, oh, I can't believe I'm in a place like this. First of all, I was kind of in disbelief and I felt like I didn't belong for sure. But I can tell you that Netflix, it's sure there's a lot of very talented people that work there. And, it's in Silicon Valley and you're working on something that everybody knows Netflix and this sort of thing. But realistically, it's not a whole bunch different than most people's tech jobs. The major differences at a company like Netflix or Google would be the scale of the things that you deal with or the problems that you deal with at times are immense, hundreds of millions of devices or whatever. It's a big, it's a lot, the scale is a lot bigger. So you end up having to solve problems in slightly different ways. But at the end of the day, the people that work there they're really smart, but they're just it's the same thing as any other place I've worked. Just maybe I'd say that the talent levels just ratcheted up a little bit because they're able to pull in a higher degree of talent. And Google is much the same way. They have this notoriously hard interview process, which means that the people that get in there had to get through that interview process. Would they get through it again? If you went to the average Googler and said, hey, can you get through this interview process again? If they're honest, they would tell you no. I mean, maybe there's a few of them that could, but most of them would not, unless they studied first for a couple of weeks. But again, it's the same sort of thing though. Like there's a slightly higher level of talent, and these huge scale problems. But I can tell you that when you're surrounded by more talented people, they boost each other up, because the people that are the best at their job aren't necessarily the people that are the most technical, believe it or not. The people that are the best at their job are not only technical, but they share and they communicate and they teach each other and they learn from each other and they absorb information. So those sorts of people are, the Googles and Netflixes of the world are just have tons of those sorts of people, and they kind of amplify each other, which is what makes environments like that so great. But you can have that in any company. It's just it's a culture thing, I think, more than anything else.
So the communication is the most important thing.
Absolutely. Yeah. 100%. There's this is fact. Every good thing that's ever happened to me in my career has happened to me because I was helping other people, period. Like if making sure, well, the other thing is you have to make sure that people see you helping other people. That's important. It's important for two reasons. One is the selfish thing of self-promotion, right? Like it makes you look good that you're helping other people. But more importantly is it shows other people that they should be helping other people. It sets a good example. And especially when they see, some of the benefits that come with that, like you get recognition, you get seen by companies that want to hire you, those sorts of things. Like if you're out there and you're listening to this and you're a smart person that likes to help people, how is some company, how is a Google or a Netflix or whatever, how are they going to know that they want you to work for them if they can't see it? So you want to make sure that you're being helpful. What I say, conspicuously helpful. So like helpful in a public way, helpful to everybody, like write blog articles or answer questions and make sure that you're being kind and generous with your knowledge and sharing what you know with other people. And if you're doing that, people will notice and they'll say, wow, this person's smart, and wow, this person is helpful, and I'd like to work with this person, because who doesn't want to work with a person that's like that, right? So that's my pro tip for people if they want to make it in the world is to be helpful, genuinely helpful to everyone around them, if as much as they can be, especially generous with their tech knowledge, and do it in public. Like make sure that you're sharing with everybody. People will see you.
What motivated you to get involved in developing RxJS library? And how has it evolved since you first started working on it?
The funny thing is, I was asked to start working on RxJS. And when I was asked, I told people very specifically that I was not qualified to do it. Like I was like, this is not for me. That's what I said. And they explained that they wanted somebody that had some open source experience, that would be able to help drive the project, and I had other people, like Paul Taylor was a guy that helped me with a lot of it. Jafar Hussein is another guy that would be able to pull in other people, work together, like help get collaborations. Like I helped with the collaboration with the Angular team, those sorts of things. And so that's how I got involved. And then over time, I mean, it went from being like this, there's 10 downloads per week on NPM, and I was like 3 of them, and the guy sitting next to me was a couple, and I knew this. And then you see it and it's all of a sudden you're like, one day it's like, well, there's 10,000 a week. And I'm just like, holy cow, like 10,000 downloads a week. Like, what's that about? And then now I think it's like 46 million a week or something weird. So, over time that scale catches up to you, and you learn different things about it's not the same as your own private project. Like I can't just change something arbitrarily about it that I want to change. Believe me, there's stuff I'd love to change about RxJS, but I can't just go in and be like, oh yeah, there's no more of this operator anymore or whatever. I'm just going to, change these schedulers all around like willy nilly and do whatever I want, release new versions, because there's millions of people using it, and it causes churn and it causes problems to do that. And I also have to take care with backwards compatibility for everything and really pay attention to make sure that, I'm not merging something that's going to break a type signature or break, like some edge case like that somebody, because there's going to be somebody that hits it because there's so many people. You learn those sorts of things. Sometimes I've learned them the hard way a couple times early on, that it's just that's different. That's the major thing that makes it different than most people's projects or even internal projects at a company. Is just the scale of it is so massive that you have to take a lot of care, and you have to make sure that you're not breaking, a bunch of people's builds. Lock files have helped with that, but there was a time when I worked on this before lock files were popular where I deployed a broken version one time, and I literally got phone calls in the middle of the night from people that I didn't work with that somehow got my phone number and were like, "Ben, you broke our builds." And I'm like, "What?" Like, go to deploy another version, like roll something back. So, it's the scale is the big thing that's changed a lot of stuff. And then, other than that, on a personal level, there's this thing where like, I think like, so right now, like I'm looking for work and, or I was anyways, I'm probably going to settle on something here in a few days, but, there are people in the world that wouldn't want to work with me because they hate RxJS, right? Like there's stuff like that happens. And that's funny to me because it's like, dude, I just wrote a library. I didn't write all the code that, some coworker tangled up in your code base with RxJS, and like, you blame me for that. I didn't write that code. So there are some funny things that happen like that where there's people that have really passionate opinions. Like they either really love it or they really hate it or they've never heard of it or whatever. And there's some weird interactions around those sorts of things.
How many people are actively working on RxJS right now?
Let's see. Well, the core team is technically roughly about, I think, 6 or 7 people. Realistically, right now, there's myself and Mladen are the 2 people that are actually contributing the most code. Because it's all volunteer, kind of wavers through. Nicholas Jamieson for a long time was contributing a lot of code, and then there's been several months where he's been taking a break, which again, totally fine, because it's all volunteer. We have there's some contributors that are not on the core team that have been pretty prolific recently, but like a lot of it, the core like code library part is mostly me. The documentation part is mostly Mladen. And then of course there's a lot of like random contributors. Like right now, over the years, it's been different. Early on, Andre Staltz did all the documentation. Paul Taylor did a lot of the heavy lifting in the core parts of the library. I implemented a whole bunch of the operators. OJ Kwan is another person that he contributed a lot of tests and operators. And then like things have evolved. Jan Nicholas Wortman, he worked on the documentation for a really long time, got most of what's going there started with him, and collaboration with Pete Bacon-Darwin and some other folks. So like there's been a lot of people that have worked on it over the years. The current core set is mostly just kind of me and Mladen, as far as people who are actively contributing in the last couple of months.
How do you see RxJS fitting into the larger JavaScript ecosystem? And what role do you see it playing in the future of front-end development?
Well, RxJS, I think that it birthed a lot of new innovations in since I took over. There's, for example, MobX was originally built with RxJS, and then it has since evolved, and I would say that MobX is probably one of the original, for modern times, it's like the reference implementation for signals, right? Like, so Angular has signals now, Solid.js has signals, and like MobX is, I think, ahead of Solid, and like Vue has a signals like thing called refs. So like there's been a lot of things like that that were kind of born from from that. There's some of the internals to Apollo GraphQL client have very RxJS-like features. If you go and you look at atoms and recoil, they're basically behavior subjects. Like there's a whole bunch of stuff that RxJS either directly or indirectly kind of influenced. So I've seen that happen over the years. Now, whether or not interest in RxJS is going to continue, it seems like it will. Like it's not like something where like there's been a sudden downswing in recent history. But I can also say that so many people, so there's a period early on when I started working on this that nobody knew how to use it. Nobody knew what it was. When they came across it, they weren't sure what certain things were. And now we've hit like more of a higher volume of people that know RxJS or understand it when they see it, or at least, vaguely understand what they're looking at if they see a merge map or a concat map or something like that. And so that's different. And I think that, that might bring some of the chatter down about it a little bit. Like if more people know what it is, like how many articles do you see about how to do something with Lodash, right? Like you don't. Not anymore. There used to be a ton, and now there's not as many. And I think that RxJS might have some of that going on right now, where there's like a large set of people that know it and understand it, and a large set of people that aren't interested in it, and therefore, like there's going to be some like maybe a little less press on it. Not concerned about it at all. Ongoing like development on the library. There's only so many ways you can merge map an observable, right? So like there's a lot of work that I'm doing right now, or that we're doing right now, to try to simplify the library and add a few features, like making sure they work with async iterables really well and those sorts of things. But realistically, like the odds that I'm going to go back and change the map operator are pretty low, right? Like it's written, it's done, it works. It's probably going to work for the duration of the JavaScript continues to work with the syntax we're using. And like there will be a point at which RxJS itself kind of goes on autopilot, other than updating to keep up with the platform.
You're listening, JavaScript Master Podcast. Listen, code, repeat. Everything you need to know to become an JavaScript super developer.
How have being a father impacted your career and approach to work?
For one thing, I can't just work all night, right? It's definitely impacted my career. When I was at Netflix, I saw them a decent amount, but I was working on RxJS at also a decent amount, and but Netflix allowed that, while I was at work. And when I left Netflix, I had to work on RxJS outside of work, which slowed down how much I was able to work on it by a lot. And then the other thing is, when I was working at Google, particularly on the Angular team, there was several months where I was working like 60 to 80 hours a day. And my youngest daughter was quite small. And there was one day I went home, and she said something to me in a whole sentence. And I was like, whoa, that was a big sentence. And my wife's like, yeah, she's been doing that for a couple months. And I was like, okay. So that was a big catalyst to me being like, you know what, maybe it's time for me to leave Silicon Valley. Maybe it's time for me to like take some of what I've earned and get a nice big house out in Texas and try to work more like 45 hours a week instead of 60 to 80 hours a week. And so that's what I did. So it's definitely affected my career in that regard, because if I were a single guy that didn't have kids or whatever, like I might still live in Silicon Valley, because it would be, having a little upstairs apartment's not a big deal. But when you got 3 kids, you need a bit more space. So it's impacted my career in that regard. It's impacted RxJS in that, like, I'm never going to prioritize RxJS over my kids. I'm so sorry. Like, if there's a big breakage that comes out, but there's also like a really important event that my kids need me at, like the breakage will have to wait till tomorrow, kind of thing. Now, I don't think that's going to happen, but it does affect that. Now, on the flip side, having kids is also a strong motivation to do good at work, do a good job with RxJS, like make sure that, I'm well behaved at public appearances and stuff like that. Cause my kids watch some of these things, right? Like, and it's also my career is my income, which I use to support my children. So, it's a strong motivator to have kids, as far as your career goes as well.
You've lived in various states across the US. Can you talk about how those experiences have shaped you as a person and a developer?
I grew up in a small town in Michigan. So for folks that aren't aware of where that is, if you look at the map and you see the Great Lakes, kind of like this huge wad of lakes in the middle of North America, like right in the middle of that is like, it looks like a mitten or like a hand. That's Michigan. And I grew up right by where the crotch of the thumb is, in a small town called Midland. And, it was like I lived there, and then I lived in Columbus, Ohio, which is a bigger city, like 2 million people is what it is now. I think it was like 700,000 at the time, where I went to art school, and I got some jobs. That's where I got my first jobs in tech, were there. Worked a little bit in Pittsburgh, and then I went to Silicon Valley, which is a wildly different place. The politics are different, the people are different. And then Texas, Austin, like moving to Texas is, the people here are very kind, a little bit kinder than they are in California. I'm sorry to say to the Californians, but at least than the Bay Area. And life here is a little bit more laid back than it was there. Like there's not as much traffic. There's, I live in the suburbs sort of thing. Since I've been here, I've been working remotely. So I don't know that my experiences here are really, like at work anyways, are reflective of Texas. The work environments in Silicon Valley were Google and Netflix, which are probably weird in their own right. There's, in Silicon Valley, you're working, or you're at a coffee shop and people are talking about startups and valuations and options and all these other things. You don't see that in Columbus, Ohio. At least you didn't back then. Maybe you do now. I don't know. But the biggest thing is when you grow up in a small town, like I feel like I'm more inclined to try to be family-ish with the people that I work with than I think maybe some people might be from a bigger city. It's not. I don't know that for a fact because I didn't grow up in a bigger town, but there's that. I tend to look for work environments that are more friendly. And the other thing is that I personally try to keep in perspective, oh my gosh, I came out to Poland to see you and just to speak at that conference, just as an example. And here I am, I was a kid that grew up in a small town that never thought I would leave that small town for anything, much less leave the country, much less go to Warsaw, Poland for anything. I never thought my eyes would see Warsaw, Poland at firsthand. That was never a thing, or be standing in front of a crowd of people that were interested in what I had to say. So I will say that growing up in that small town environment does affect that. And it's never going and doing those things has never, ever lost its wonder for me. It's never, well, I said, at least I hope it hasn't gone from other people's perspectives anyway, it's gone to my head. But I also I didn't get to that until I was much older too. I wasn't, I worry a little bit about some of these folks that are 20, 22, 23, and they're suddenly tech famous, because I've seen personality changes, because you're still kind of figuring out who you are at that age. And I didn't start doing any of this until I was 38 or 30. I'm 45 now. That probably changes my perspective on that a little bit as well. But yeah, I'm still a small town guy. I would love to go back and live in a small town, to be honest. I like that.
Can you discuss your passion for art and how it influences your work in tech?
Some people know this, some people don't. I actually had scholarships and stuff to go to art school for illustration. And I really like to draw and paint. I don't do it enough. I actually, because of parenting and work and open source, I barely do it at all, to be honest. It's a crime. I should be doing it more. I feel like I'm kind of like wasting that talent or whatever. But the building of UIs is a visual thing, and art is a visual thing. And in that way, they're kind of related. But the way that art and programming is related to me in a way that I think other people might not really understand is that when you're making a painting or you're doing a drawing, what you're really doing is you're taking what you see or what your vision is to have something, and you're breaking it down into various components, and then you're implementing those components and measuring the whole time against everything else to make sure your proportions are right, and that you're building it, especially when you're painting, you're kind of building it from like you get a drawing and then you have an underlayer and then you build on top of that and you build on top of that, and you have to mix colors together in certain ways. And like everything you're doing is construction when you're building, when you're drawing something or when you're painting something or when you're sculpting something or whatever. But in particular, drawing and painting is more my focus. And it's the same thing when you're programming, right? Like you have, you have this goal in mind of what you want to build, and you have to break it down into the smaller pieces of how you're going to implement it. And then as you're doing it, you have to measure. And so in that regard, they both are attractive to me in the same way. And then at the end, ideally you have something where you show somebody and they're like, wow, that's really cool, or whoa, that's really useful, or I like the way that looks, or whatever. And, in that regard, art and programming are very much the same.
Then who is your favorite artist?
Gosh, there's probably too many to mention. Like recently, I've been looking at like Henri Martin. It was like a pointillist painter. Very, very interesting stuff. Like, I don't know, there's so many, like Edgar Degas is really interesting, especially when you look at like some of the history about like, he's famous for doing these paintings of ballerinas, but like if you look into like the history of what was going on in these plays, it was pretty dark, and some of the figures, the dark figures he has painted in the background are pretty interesting. Gosh, like I don't know. It's Edward Hopper. I like all sorts of artists. It's really hard for me to pick just one. MC Escher is probably one that a lot of programmers really like because it's very mathematical. And I had the pleasure of actually going and seeing a display that was all MC Escher's work, which is pretty interesting. But yeah, I love it. So whenever I'm traveling, my number one stop when I travel anywhere new, especially, is to find the local art museum and go see pieces. And sometimes I'll even have other people at like a tech conference or something, and they'll be like, "Can I go with you?" And I'll be like, "I don't think you want to go with me." Like, why? Because you'll be dragging me through. Because actually, I'm stopping and reading and looking, and like I'm there to enjoy it, the artwork, more than I am to socialize or whatever. So, so that's something to know. If you see me at a conference and you're like, "Are you going to an art museum?" I'm like, "Yeah," and you're like, if you think about going with me, unless you're someone that really wants to discuss the art or like be there for a while, like you probably don't want to go with me. So, do you like Salvador Dali? So yeah, I know Salvador Dali. He's great. He's my favorite, definitely. It's very good. The other one is a Rene and Marguerite. If you like Salvador Dali, I would check that out. Now let's go back to RxJS. What are the most common misconceptions about RxJS and how to deal with them? One is that you have to use the operators. You do not have to use the operators. Proof in that is the fact that the operators themselves quite often don't use operators inside of themselves, right? Like anything you can do with an operator, you could do by just subscribing if you wanted. So that's one kind of thing. And like the reason I point that out is because honestly, to me, the observable as a type is a fantastic type. We probably need it in the language. We definitely need it in various platforms in one form or another. It doesn't even have to be exactly like RxJS is observable, but some sort of observable. And I feel like the things that people do with the operators oftentimes gets conflated with observables. And that's just something you can do with observables. That's not observable, right? Like, so the observable itself is a really important type. I think that there's some sort of misconception that there's like the RxJS way to do things. There's really not like you don't have to do filter map, like for each transformation, let's do another map and then do a merge map. Like you could literally just have a merge map that did all 4 of those steps in one spot. That's fine. If you need to have a side effect from inside of your map, it's not the end of the world. Like it's okay. Like unless you're pulling that map function out and testing it directly or some other weird circumstance, it's probably all right to have side effects in some cases, right? From if you're doing like map and then tap right afterwards, you could just do the tap thing inside the map. It's fine. Or tap and then map or whatever. Like it's not going to make that big of a difference. And I don't think people realize that for every operator that you use, you're creating a new subscription. And for every operator that you use inside of like a concat map or merge map, you're creating a new subscription times however many values that handles. Right. So it's something that people, for like efficiency reasons, they don't really think about these things. And, most of the time that's fine. But when you get into a situation where performance really matters, I think that sometimes people shoot themselves in the foot by trying to do things the RX way when there is no RX way. You can just be as efficient as you can be if when performance matters. Now, the other thing that I don't think people realize is if you say what const source equals, and then you're like some observable pipe operator, like all this stuff all the way down. Technically, source is an observable. That means that you could write it by saying source equals new observable and do a whole bunch of imperative code in there that only nexted when it was supposed to. And they're both the same and they can both be used the same way. And so anytime someone says something like, oh, well, I could write imperative code that's faster than RxJS, I just take their imperative code and I wrap it in new observable and I next it out. And it's like, oh, look, it's the same code. It's just as fast, only now it's this observable shape. Now it has, guaranteed teardown and guaranteed memory management and these other things because of observable. Like, yes, like the operators themselves, they're a domain specific language, and a programming language is like only going to be as good as the person writing it, right? So if you write a bunch of bad JavaScript, it's going to be bad. If you write a bunch of bad RxJS, it's going to be bad. So the only thing it might save you from is that memory management thing, which is good. But at the end of the day, there's no imperative code that would be faster than RxJS. Like that's just silly. You can wrap that same imperative code in observable and it's RxJS again. Like that's not a thing. But yeah, misconceptions are just like that they have to do map, merge map, group by merge map, like to array, all this other stuff. Like you want to try to do the least amount of work possible when you're writing code of any sort. And that's true for RxJS as well.
Can you share some tips for developers who are just getting started with RxJS and how to approach learning the library?
Sure. The first thing I would do would be just play with the observable type itself. Like open up a Sacklets or whatever, make a new observable, add something to the teardown function, like put some console logs in there and see what happens, subscribe to it. Like just like start there. Now, the next thing you do is if you get an observable and you're like, oh, I feel like I have to use operators for this stuff. You're not really. Like, just imagine what you would do with promises or with a promise that was giving you multiple values over time and just do that. Like everyone's written code that has been like add event listener, for example, gives you multiple values over time. A promise gives you a single value asynchronously. Like everyone's written code that does that with then and add event listener. Like you can just write code against RxJS observables and just subscribe and do stuff. And what have you lost at that point? Nothing. You've just done the same thing that you would have done anyways. So like that's a starting point. And then after that, it's worth looking into, some of the more clever things you can do with it, like use concat map or, switch map. Those are two where there's some pretty immediate benefit for a lot of use cases. But like I wouldn't go hog wild with group buys and like feeling like you need to know everything. You don't need to know everything. You do need to know how the observable itself works. Subscribe, unsubscribe, like what happens when you next and complete all that stuff. Experiment with that. Map and filter, I think most people get pretty straightforward because of arrays and stuff. But like beyond that, concat map, switch map are probably good to learn. Maybe catch error or something like that. But and then just work your way into retries and all repeats and these other things. But mostly just start small, start simple. The simpler your code is, the easier it'll be to maintain anyway. So that's where I'd get people to start. Play with it.
What are some of the most exciting recent developments in RxJS community and how they are impacting the library and its users?
In recent history, there's like developments outside of RxJS that are exciting. There's an iterable helpers proposal for the TC39, where they're actually they've added, as a lot of people know, flat map to arrays. So flat map is basically concat map for arrays. It's a very similar concept. So there's more knowledge in the world about flattening operations and what that really means, at least for arrays, and soon to be for async iterables. And because of that, like the jump to something like RxJS is a lot smaller than it used to be. So that's a good thing. There's also, like I said, async iterables now, where there's a 408 syntax for reading from an async iterable. RxJS 8 allows you to subscribe with that same syntax. So you can say 408 value of some observable and it will just work. And inside of there, as values come along, it kind of queues it, just like a concat map really is. It kind of queues up the values and it executes the body of that 408 loop one at a time. And you can await things or do whatever you want inside of it. So as a means of consumption, it's pretty interesting that those things exist. But yeah, I think that, outside developments related to RxJS are pretty good. I'm a little sad about the current pipeline operator proposal. It's not something that will work well with anybody's library. It's very different. Like no existing pipeable library will work with the new pipeline operator, unfortunately. So I've kind of taken my eyes off of that. And I'm actually kind of hopeful it doesn't pass, because it would be good to get a pipeline operator in that would work with other people's libraries. But there's that's outside. Now inside RxJS, like in recent years, I went through version 7 was like 50% the size of version 6. So it's like half the size. And then version 7.4, there were some performance improvements that I was able to do we were able to do that made it like 30 times faster in a lot of cases. So it's smaller and faster than it's ever been. And then in version 8, we're finally removing a lot of the deprecated APIs that have been there for years. And so that makes it even smaller and even faster in some cases. And we're moving away from lift internally as a mechanism to where, because that was there because closures were slow when I first started working on this, and they're not slow anymore. So we don't really need that as much. And that means that the internals of our library are going to be implemented in such a way that if you went and looked at the code, it's implemented the same way you should be implementing the code, right? So like we're simplifying things. It's getting easier to work on, easier to look at, easier to understand. And I think that's going to be good for everybody. That's probably the most exciting thing we've got going on.
How do you approach managing an open source project like RxJS, and what are some of the biggest challenges you face?
the biggest challenge that I face is like, this is volunteer work. This is not like, some people expect the response time on like this to be similar to the response time you would have with like an Apollo GraphQL or an Angular project or something like that. And those have paid employees, like dozens of paid employees in some cases, that are interacting with people on those issues. And we just simply don't have that. So sometimes there's issues that they get filed, fall through the cracks. It's hard to sift through. Like a lot of issues will come up and they're just duplicates of other issues, or they're not actually issues. They're just people asking how to do something. And those things are hard. The other thing that's hard about managing an open source project is people will show up and they'll pour their hearts into like huge amounts of work, and you can see it and they're so passionate about it, but it's not something that you agree with or that you can merge for one reason or the other. And it's absolutely heartbreaking to be like, I'm sorry that you did all this work, but I have to close your PR now, or I have to close your issue. I recommend that you just implement, your own library or your own like third party, community driven thing. That's a rough side to it. The main thing that I try to do when I approach this stuff is, I make sure that when I'm talking or speaking with people or responding to people, it's like we're doing this together. Like if I approve your PR, I'm responsible for it too. And frankly, they're probably not going to come back to fix anything later. I'm going to have to fix it. So like, that we're doing this together is a lot of like, not, hey, why did you do this? Why did you screw this up? Why did you, like, making sure that it's framed as a team thing. And then, the just trying to be empathetic and sympathetic with people that are using it. Like sometimes you'll get people that come in, they're just so frustrated because they've like some previous employee at their company wrote some crazy RxJS code and they're on the hook for maintaining it, and they have no idea why some behaviors is the way it is. And the answer is almost always like, you probably need to simplify this code, but I'll help you look through it or whatever. So just trying to be sympathetic to those folks. And mostly like the other big thing is, like I was saying earlier, just being mindful of like what you're merging, how you're planning things out, how you're spacing things out, how quickly you're moving, and the messaging around those things. I know that if I go into the RxJS or even get on Twitter and I say something that sounds like I'm changing direction for RxJS, there's a whole bunch of people that take it to heart and they reference it in talks and blog posts for a while. And so there's some of that too that you have to be mindful of.
Do you see RxJS as one of the biggest open source projects today?
It's up there. I don't know if it's one of the biggest in terms of usage, just raw, straight, like how many people have downloaded this, how many people are using this either directly or indirectly because of some third party thing. Yeah, there's a lot. 46 million downloads per week of RxJS, as opposed to like if you look at Angular core, which is definitely a big project, is like 3 million downloads a week, right? So RxJS does get used a lot for a lot of things. Outside of Angular, like a lot of people think it's purely an Angular thing, and it gets used for node processes, all sorts of everything you can imagine. If you look at like PlayStation or whatever, it's being used in PlayStation for state management type stuff. It's a big project. But from my perspective, it's a utility library for dealing with this observable type, right? So we're trying to maintain that as best we can. And I try not to think about how big it is sometimes, but it is quite a big project.
How do you see the role of functional programming evolving in front-end development, and how does RxJS fit into that picture?
Front-end development has started in recent years to use more functional programming. I mean, if you look at like React moved to just actually using just functions for their entire component. Like their component is a function that returns JSX, right? And you even see things like pure components and stuff in the React world. there's a lot of, I feel like there's a period where RxJS and then there's like Ramda and a few other things got really, really wildly popular, Cycle.js, a bunch of other things. It's super useful. It's a really extensible way to get things done. However, it can also be a very confusing way to get things done for people. So I think that there is a time where there's a huge push towards it, and then there's been a little bit of a pullback, and now what you're seeing is some sort of middle ground where you have functional programming, but some of it's hidden away from you, or there's functional programming, but with this imperative API that you can dive into the functional side of it, right? Like, so I feel like it's never really going to go away. It's always going to be there. We don't get a lot of language features for functional programming and JavaScript, and that's because there's some folks in the TC39 that are like, oh, this isn't a functional, language, like as a first class thing. But that said, it does support functional programming quite well, with closures and everything else, and like arrow functions and those sorts of things. So I don't see it going away anytime soon. I feel like more and more people understand it a bit better. Yeah, like there's I feel like there was a big, huge push for it for a while, and it's kind of come back. Now, RxJS, there's a lot of functional programming in RxJS. We use a lot of higher order functions to define things like operators. We pipe things, which is a functional thing. Like, so I think there's a role that RxJS has played probably in introducing people to some of like the basics of functional programming. And it still definitely gets used a lot for, functional reactive programming to a degree, not the academic definition of it, but functional reactive programming. It's played a role. I don't know if it's been the most important role, but it's definitely helped a lot of people get indoctrinated into it. And I think that, but I do think that maybe we're starting to get to a more sane world of functional programming where people are only kind of using it where it makes sense. And it does make really good sense in some cases, but in other cases, it doesn't make so much sense. So
what advice do you have for developers who want to become more involved in JavaScript community, and how can they get started?
Let's see. If you want to get involved in the JavaScript community, a lot of people focus on like, how do I contribute to the core project? Like, how do I write code? And I think the driver there is some people look and they're like, oh, there's a lot of glory in being like, oh, I've contributed to this thing. And so, and there can be, and I recommend that people try to contribute there. However, I can tell you that some of the most well-known figures in the JavaScript community don't contribute a ton to core libraries. What they do is, instead of helping those libraries, they help everybody else, right? They help everybody else understand libraries, or how to program with those, or how to interact between those and some other library. Like, people who are out blogging or doing podcasts or doing live streams of like how to do stuff, and they're helping other people. That's a really good way to be a part of a JavaScript community, especially if you specialize in something. Like, if you want to get into, because like you'll get noticed by people that are the core authors of libraries and stuff, because like I don't have time. I can't just go out and make endless tutorials about RxJS or what to do or how to do it. Frankly, I just do not have the time, and a lot of that's the same case for most people that are authors of frameworks and other things. And so there's a lot of space there to become well-known or become part of a known part of a JavaScript community, but you have to be consistent, and you have to be kind, and you have to be generous. And like, if you're doing those things, if you're being consistent, kind, and generous, I think that it's just a matter of time before people notice you and notice your contributions. And you also have to be willing to learn. You can't be like arrogant, right? Like, but that's part of being kind. Like, you have to be willing to learn. Like, if you mess up your blog post or whatever, be able to go back and change it, or be like, oh, sorry, I messed this up, and here's this new thing I learned, and then share it with everybody. Real important. Most developers want to write code and they do not want to write documentation. And so if you want to know how to help a developer with their project, there's your answer right there. What do they not want to do? If you do that for them, they're going to love you. They're going to think you're the best. So yeah, like if you're providing even community-driven documentation via blogs or whatever of any sort, like material to help people learn about the library, that's the library authors are going to know you and like you for sure.
Can you talk about your experience with the Angular framework and how it compares to work on RxJS?
So my experience with the Angular framework, it's funny, like so everything I did at Netflix was like Ember and React. And then everything I've done since I was at Google has been React. So only while I was at Google did I actually work with and on Angular. It's interesting because my experience with it is that they leaned heavily into RxJS early on, and then they really got distracted by the Ivy rewrite, and there was a long period where people were really begging for more observable like features that would like give you an API to be like, oh, I want to get an observable of button clicks or whatever. Like, well, they wanted an easier way to do that. It's interesting because of Ivy and because of what happened with Zones.js, like Zones.js not getting standardized and like then async await promises not being patchable by zones. Like there was like a long kind of dodge of like not doing those things, like leaning harder into that sort of reactivity. I mean, I was on the team and I didn't do anything but work on Ivy the whole time I was on the team. And so it's interesting to me because there's other frameworks out like Svelte that really work with RxJS in a very first class way, like very directly work with RxJS, which is interesting. And just by default, just because they happened upon implementing their own observables internally that were the same shape, right? So it's Angular's got the async pipe thing. They never fully leaned into like having observables just write out without having that pipe, without those sorts of things, which I always thought was kind of interesting. Now they've got signals, of course, and I think signals are a fine choice. I mean, they're basically the same thing that Ember was doing probably like 9-10 years ago. But Ember was like using very you directly had to say your dependencies in there. It wasn't just like defining your dependencies based off of an execution context, which is what Angular does. Time will tell. Like there's some weird points with that. Like I feel like the interop between signals and RxJS could be a lot better, but like we'll see. Like Angular, the Angular community has been so tremendously kind to me. The Angular team is full of wonderful people. Angular at large has really adopted RxJS and just loves it to death. Like there's a lot of interest there. There's a lot of people building amazing stuff with RxJS in the Angular community. And in that degree, to that degree, I think that my experience with Angular has been very, very positive. Like I love going to Angular conferences. I love speaking with Angular developers. I even like working with Angular, but mostly I like the community more than anything else. I do think that looking back, it's a little bit of a shame that there wasn't some more prioritization of some features to make dealing with RxJS inside of Angular a little bit easier. But the community has kind of leaned in and made some of those things themselves, so it's probably okay. But yeah, that's my experience with Angular, really in a nutshell, I guess.
What are some of your goals of the future of RxJS? And how do you see the library evolving in the coming years?
The biggest overall, what I want with RxJS is I want to make it very simple, like to just try to simplify the code base as much as possible and make it as quick as possible. I want to try to get more people educated on the right things to do with it. And I haven't done a great job of that over the years, but again, it's volunteer work. It's hard for me to get the time to do that. But one other thing is trying to make RxJS compatible with any well-behaved, properly shaped observable. So if you have an observable that isn't one of ours, hopefully it works with our operators, right? Like that's what we want to make happen. I'm also trying to get us to publish observable by itself. So if you have a library and you want your library to use observables because you want a well-behaved multi-value asynchronous type, and because there's tons of libraries out here that do this, there's like Apollo GraphQL. You can look through dozens of really well-known libraries that have like some sort of observable implementation they rolled themselves that might not be that well-behaved. Like I want them to be able to import, here's just the battle-tested RxJS observable and just the observable, and I'll use that. And ideally, at some point, platforms implement an observable that's roughly the same shape, and they can ditch the RxJS observable and start using that instead. And RxJS will do the same thing. If there's a observable in the platform, then all of a sudden RxJS becomes just a utility library to deal with observables in some functional way with also these operators and stuff. But that's where I see it going. And ideally, my ideal scenario is observables are implemented in every platform, and I hand RxJS off, or I set it on autopilot and watch it go into the sunset and retire from the business, because I think that observables, the actual type themselves, are incredibly important. They're a missing piece of our platform in a lot of ways as a primitive. And I would like, because people keep reinventing it all over the place, and I would like to see that part embraced. And then RxJS, I think it'll keep being used for a long time. A lot of people really love it. It's very useful. It's a domain-specific language for dealing with asynchronous events. It's just what you do when you program, right? So I think that it'll be around for a very long time. I probably will never, ever put it down. I'll probably constantly be poking at it.
Ben, huge thanks for joining me today on this dope podcast episode. Your insights were straight fire, and I am sure our listeners had a blast. I am thrilled to have you here.
Same. Thank you so much for having me on.